Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Friday, January the 7th, 2022. It's a very windy day in Victoria today. I was out a couple of hours ago, out on Douglas Street, and the wind was 35 miles an hour, gusting to 50 miles per hour. Nonetheless, I observed that about 2/3 of all of the people outside, whether singly or in pairs, were wearing masks. And I was reminded of the Ulsterman priest in Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. A lot of idiots you are, selling your own birthright for a saucer of cold porridge. Yes, of course, that is a reference to the story of Esau, who sold his birthright for a mess of red pottage, lentil stew. And I suppose this is what we have been reduced to in Canada. What's the organizing principle of Canada? Well, it used to be the Empire, and that was all swept away. Our traditions were all swept away in Canada. And then it became, the welfare state. Our welfare state was the best welfare state in the world. Actually, it isn't. It's not even close. But Canada clung on to that for a while. What's left? Disdain for the United States, a feeling of smugness. And that's not really much to keep a country together. One can say all sorts of things in support of or against the welfare state, but one thing is for certain. The welfare state turns people into children. Oh no, we can't possibly do anything without our beneficent government intervening. And, well, the government is our father and our mother, actually. And the government will look after us. Well, we'll see how long that organizing principle lasts during the COVID-19 hysteria. I'm reminded that Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was prime minister in October 1970 when two people, Pierre Laporte and James Cross, were kidnapped by the Front de Libération du Québec. Two people were kidnapped in the whole country. And what was the result? The War Measures Act. And the War Measures Act put the entire country of Canada under martial law. Yeah, that's right. Suspension of habeas corpus, all that sort of thing. People being swept up and thrown into prison for months because they were thought to be suspicious. Now, what was the reaction of Canadians? Well, they seem to be overwhelmingly in favor of it. The only political leader to stand out against it was Tommy Douglas, the leader of the NDP. There were, at that time, about 50 members of the FLQ. And again, two people were kidnapped. Pierre Laporte was subsequently murdered, but it turned out that the hapless Quebec provincial police had been in the house where he was being held several times and hadn't managed to find him. So that is the modern tradition of Canada, which is a tyranny, really. Oh, we have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but of course the Charter of Rights and Freedoms means exactly what the unelected Supreme Court of Canada decides that it means. Oh, and it's cleverly built into our Constitution that peace, order, and good government trump all. So, things like the ability to leave your home or not to get jabbed with an experimental mRNA device. Well, I don't think that our Supreme Court would have any difficulty with that. I don't think so at all. What's the latest on the Omicron variant? Well, there's a piece by Stephen Matthews and Emily Craig from the Daily Mail. Omicron could be even less deadly than flu, scientists believe, in a boost to hopes that the worst of the pandemic is over. Some experts have always maintained that the coronavirus would eventually morph into a seasonal cold-like virus as the world develops immunity through vaccines and natural infection. But the emergence of the highly mutated Omicron variant appears to have sped the process up. Mail Online analysis shows COVID killed 1 in 33 people who tested positive at the peak of the devastating second wave last January, compared to just 1 in 670 now. But experts believe the figure could be even lower because of Omicron. The case fatality rate, the proportion of confirmed infections that end in death for seasonal influenza, is 0.1, the equivalent of 1 in 8,000. One former government advisor today said if the trend continues to drop, then we should be asking whether we are justified in having any measures that we would not bring in for a bad flu season. But other experts say coronavirus is much more transmissible than flu, meaning it will inevitably cause more deaths. Meanwhile, researchers at Washington University modeling the next stage of the pandemic expect Omicron to kill up to 99% fewer people than Delta. In another hint, it could be less deadly than flu. And here's a report from Canada from Elizabeth McMillan of CBC News. Despite some hospitalizations due to COVID-19, the head of pediatrics at the IWK Health Center in Halifax says he's far more concerned about the impact of the flu and other common viruses on children. Dr. Andrew Link, who is also the chief and chair of the pediatrics department at Dalhousie University, said the IWK and regional hospitals have seen, quote, very few children admitted due to COVID-19, even in the weeks since the Omicron variant hit Nova Scotia. During his recent shifts at the Children's Hospital in Halifax, he said there were 2 children, one of whom was very young, admitted for a few days. Quote, the ones that we have admitted have been mild and brief for the most part. It's not to say that a child with certain high risk factors couldn't get quite sick from it, but we're certainly not seeing that, unquote. And let's have some more data. This is from CP24 because, data is useful, right? Because it's all about the science. And science is based on data, right? That was always my understanding. Science is based on empirical evidence. This is from Carissa Wilson at CP24. The Ontario Ministry of Health says that more than 2,400 people are currently hospitalized with COVID-19, marking a new record for hospitalizations throughout the pandemic. Among the hospitalized patients, 100 are partially vaccinated, over 600 have an unknown vaccination status, 441 are unvaccinated, and 1,327 are fully vaccinated. How about that? How about that? You see, the vaccine, perfectly safe and really outstandingly high efficacy. That's what we were told. It turns out that it is not true. Ontario logged 11,899 new coronavirus infections today, down from 13,339 yesterday, but actual case counts are likely much higher due to limited testing capacity reserved for high-risk individuals. Among the latest cases, 375 are partially vaccinated, 466 have an unknown vaccination status, 1,543 are unvaccinated, and 9,515 are fully vaccinated. And let's look at some data from the province of Quebec, which is now Canada's leader in pandemic panic porn. And this is a tweet from the real sassy princess. Vaxxed make up majority of cases. I'm sorry, this is the data I was talking about yesterday, saying pretty much the same thing, came from Quebec. This is from Ontario. She is retweeting John Nisbet, who said, for the first time in Ontario, the vaccinated make up the majority of cases, hospitalizations, and ICU admissions in the last 24 hours since recording began. And so what is before we get to the government response, what's the media response? This is from Keenan Beck's The Counter Signal. On January 6, CTV News changed its article and headline after journalists accidentally admitted that the recent spike in cases in Canada is mainly in the vaccinated population, which suggests a pandemic of the vaccinated. Initially, the headline read, "Watch, vaccinated now outnumber the unvaccinated in Calgary hospitals." Apparently, somebody up top didn't like that, though, and it was quickly changed to "Vaccinated hospital patients outpace the unvaccinated, but it doesn't mean the shots don't work. Experts." Yes, of course. A CTV News journalist Tim Brook writes, numbers showing the majority of Alberta's COVID-19 hospital admissions are in vaccinated individuals doesn't tell the whole story, regardless of what some conspiracy theorists believe. And Beck's comments, conspiracy theorists, do you mean the people who have looked at the data and made accurate predictions for 2 years straight? Indeed, this is a tacit admission that the conspiracy theorists were right, at least on one point. The vaccine doesn't prevent transmission and will not end the pandemic. But so what's the reaction from Canada's federal government in the person of Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos? Provinces are likely to introduce mandatory vaccination policies in the coming months to deal with surging COVID caseloads, Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos said today. Quote, "What we see now is that our healthcare system in Canada is fragile. Our people are tired, and the only way that we know to get through COVID-19, this variant and any future variant, is through vaccination." Unquote. Duclos said that while rapid tests, masking, and social distancing are useful tools, they won't end the pandemic on their own. 50% of hospitalizations now in Quebec are due to people not having been vaccinated. That's only if you assume that all of the people with unknown status are unvaccinated, which is obviously not possible. Now, they've been playing the ratio game with us. Oh, look at the number of cases and the ratio of the unvaccinated, and they've stopped talking about that. Oh, what about hospital admissions? No, they've stopped talking about that. Well, what about ICU beds? Yeah, well, they're going to have to stop talking about that as well. Duclos continued, "That's a burden on healthcare workers, a burden on society, which is very difficult to bear and for many people difficult to understand. That's why I'm signaling this is a conversation which I believe provinces and territories in support with the federal government will want to have over the next weeks and months." Duclos said that while discussions about mandatory vaccination policies are not taking place now, he believes that, based on his personal understanding of what we see internationally and domestically, and in my conversations with health ministers over the last few weeks, the discussion will start in the coming weeks or months. Well, given that the provinces are dependent on federal money for their healthcare systems, these discussions might be a little one-sided. Yes, a little one-sided. Now, of course, Trudeau's government could ram through a law in Parliament, and I'm sure they'd have the support of the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, essentially bringing back a War Measures Act for the sanitary dictatorship. Now, who would object? I don't even know whether the Conservative Party would object. The nominally Conservative Party. A spokesperson for Quebec's health minister said Friday that mandatory vaccination is not something the province is looking at yet. On Twitter, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney said his government will not make vaccines mandatory. Quote, Alberta's legislature removed the power of mandatory vaccination from the Public Health Act last year and will not revisit that decision, period. So what are we looking at here? What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at a situation that, certainly in terms of Omicron, the vaccines have failed. And so what is the government going to do about that? Or what does the government want the provinces to do? Well, double down. That's what. Double down on vaccines. Yes. Here's my syllogism. 1, new COVID-19 cases. The vax have for weeks dwarfed the unvaxxed in Ontario. 2, ICU beds. The vax now occupy more beds than the unvaxxed in Quebec. 3, ergo, mandatory vaccination is quite simply a vengeful and a humiliated sanitary dictatorship, eliminating the control group. That's the whole point of this. It's not just the fixed cost fallacy. It is eliminating the control group. Because the governments are still claiming that the vaccinations work when they clearly don't. And we have moved into negative efficacy territory here, with all of the data indicating that the more jabs you get, the worse you are vis-a-vis Omicron. But if you get everyone vaxxed, then you don't have a control group anymore, and you can keep on maintaining the lie that the vax work. And of course, I suppose, people aren't using proper masks, or they're not social distancing enough, etc., etc., etc. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Anrun, Zen Master Football Analysis Dan, William Hicks, Walrus the Libertarian. William Hicks says 35 to 50 miles per hour, whoosh. That's not uncommon where I live. Flights from Victoria to Vancouver are usually canceled several days of the year. Ditto ferries from Vancouver Island to the mainland. It's windy. It's windy here. I mean, which has its advantages. I mean, air quality is quite good here compared to Vancouver. Anwar says, I don't know what was more Clown World Banana Republic today, those 3 poor men in Georgia getting life in the jogger case, or Biden's lawyer effectively calling the vax uniquely effective in the SC. Well, I suppose if I went on Twitter, I could find a great many people with regard to the Arbery case, gloating, reveling in the fact that these 3 men are going to become rape toys in prison. Hello to Half Galician, Tom Anderson. Metal Mike says, welcome to the Terror Dome. Walrus Libertarian says, my worksite in Ontario is making it mandatory. Brandon Smith says, once they outsourced labor, they precluded the need for a domestic population. Anwar says, Kevin, do you think the COVID insanity in Canada will be ending anytime soon? You said or suggested it will be ending in the USA. Well, with regard to COVID, whatever America does is wrong. It was wrong under Trump, and it's wrong under Biden. That Trudeau was, an apostle for the virus, even before for the vaccine, even before it was created. And the Canadian government the federal government, have adopted a zero COVID policy, which is, of course, objectively insane. Hello to David Wright and Tom Anderson, who says it is literally impossible to inject the entire world's population every 6 months or however long. The science says. Oh, I don't know. The entire world's population. Canada might be up for it. I wonder how many are getting the first jab, or are there remaining just booster cyclers? The vaccine is like a phone battery, says Zen Master. The more it is charged, the quicker it runs out. William Hicks says, CDC says studies have also shown that side effects from the vaccine are extremely rare, despite 20,000 deaths and 100K hospitalizations over 12 months on VAERS, a passive reporting system. 1 million cases reported to VAERS. Now, it's past 1 million. And you still have clowns like Stephen Marr of McLean saying, oh, so very, very rare. And we all know that the VAERS system is underreported. Teleologic Jones next they will be saying, well, we should have been doing this all along for flu anyway. We've been far too tolerant of sickness and death. Well, the question that was asked last year was, vaccines for a coronavirus. There's never been a successful vaccine for a coronavirus. Do you think that if the drug companies believe that they could come up with a vaccine for the flu, well, they have, they don't work, or the common cold? You know how many hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars they could make from that? No, it's constantly mutating. That's the reason why it doesn't work. Metal Mike says, no doubt Doug Ford will go along with it. I suppose it will mean losing one's job, being denied EI, pension, etc. No jabs equals starvation. I'm not going to be jabbed. I mean, I'll stay in this hotel room forever if I have to. And I'll buy, 1,000 boxes of Triscuits or whatever and see how long I can hold out. They're going to have to strap me to a gurney in order to do this. Red Sulphur Cafe says, anyone watch the January 6th liturgy? I don't know what that is in reference to. Tom Anderson says, Jimmy Dore has been doing great work exposing the jab. Brandon Smith says, leper colonies may be making a comeback. Oscar Tosa, it is somewhat strange that the scientific elites have been saying we've been overpopulated for decades, yet they are also trying to neurotically keep everyone alive. Well, I'll be talking about euthanasia a little while later. Tom Anderson says Australia has prison camps for the unvaxxed. Hauper says insanity has pretty strong legs these days. V. Who says, I love science. William Hicks says these mRNA drugs have been administered for only 12 months. So there's no long-term studies. And of course, Pfizer says we're not going to get the studies from them for what? Yeah. It's in 2024, 2025 or something like that. The cringe ceremony at the U.S. Capitol, said Red Sulphur Cafe. Well, the cast of Hamilton was singing along, weren't they? John S. says, I'm a Triscuit fan myself. Well, you see that what's the jab become? It's become like Holy Communion for Christians. That's what it has become. Accumulated effects via boosters, says William Hicks. Tom Anderson says, I know Scottish justices are largely unthinking pawns who simply read off whatever their clerks give them, but this level of extreme lying seems unprecedented. David Wright says, high-carb diet will kill KMG instead. Probably true. Probably true. And let's see. Red Sulphur Cafe says that a femtard in drugstore yelled at me today for not having a perfectly placed mask today. Okay. Yes, KMG, shutdowns have stopped. Not in my province. Of course, it's worse in Ontario and much worse in Quebec. Bonnie Henry, who I'm not a fan of, is being crucified because all activity in British Columbia has not stopped. I mean, I'm not the first person to observe this, but when you gin up terror in people for 2 years and then you try to pull back as Biden has done, you just go on Twitter, or I don't use Facebook, but I know people who do, and Facebook is largely female dominated. There's a great deal of women, a lot of them teachers and civil servants and the like, who are loving this. They are just loving this. Dan says Turkey started their 5th booster. And, okay, let's get back to it here. John Ivison, who I mentioned the other day as being the first person in the regime media to talk about what Justin Trudeau has said to Julie Schneider about whether we should tolerate uh, the unvaccinated, whether we should tolerate, yes. Uh, I see that Trudeau and, well, most of our leaders, they don't understand how representative government is supposed to work. We tolerate them, they don't tolerate us. So when it comes to anti-vaxxers, John Ivison writes in the National Post, we need to talk about numbers, but in a civil tone. In an article last week that took Justin Trudeau to task for labeling vaccine refuseniks as misogynist and racist, I put forward my own censorious analogy. It's not like refusing to wear a seatbelt, it's more comparable to driving drunk, I wrote. Well, you're an idiot, okay? Because it would be one thing to argue that if, I don't know, COVID-19 were like tuberculosis or, the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague. But no, it isn't. That's the one. Second, the vaccines have stopped working. And there's growing evidence that the vaccines are severely compromising our immune systems. Ivison continues, the point I was trying to make is that people have a responsibility to their fellow citizens to get vaccinated in the same way they have a duty not to drive drunk. That sentiment is shared by most Canadians, according to opinion polls. Recent research by Esaus suggests 2/3 of people are losing patience with people who refuse to get vaccinated, and 3/4 support vaccine passports. Well, this is what Chomsky and Herman called manufactured consent. Because apart from a few dissident squawks in the Toronto Sun and, the non-regime media, which is severely repressed in my country, it has been wall-to-wall, wear mask, social distancing, because they totally work. Get the vax again, get the vax 3 times, shut up with your dissidents and listen to the government, because the government is never wrong. The government has your best interests at heart. And if you express skepticism, then you are, a traitor and quite possibly a terrorist. This is from, CBC News. Vaccinated individuals who have recently been infected with COVID-19 should still get a 3rd shot, despite the natural immune response from the infection itself, according to BC's provincial health officer and an SFU expert. When you are feeling better and recovered from that infection, then you can get your booster dose, and we do encourage you to get your booster dose, Dr. Bonnie Henry said Tuesday. Ralph Pantoflet, an associate professor in Simon Fraser University's Faculty of Health Sciences, says just as people who were infected prior to the introduction of vaccines were encouraged to get immunized, vaccinated people who are infected should get a 3rd shot post-recovery, as the natural level of natural immunity following an infection varies from person to person. Yeah, okay, sure. I'm sure that's true. But what we know about the protection from the vax, 1 dose, 2 dose, 3 dose, nosedives. And it's nosediving. The more jabs you get, the faster it goes into negative efficacy territory. And let's take a look at my barometer. My barometer of Canadian COVID panic porn. That would be Bruce Arthur of the Toronto Star. My question to these people, are any of them looking at the data? Are any of them looking at the data? Because if they were looking at the data, they might come to different conclusions. Timothy Caulfield, who is Canada's favorite Bryan Singer lookalike, writes, despite perceived tensions, we shouldn't forget the reality. There is strong support for vaccines, masks, mandates, and passports. Yes, again, manufactured consent. A woman called Alheli Picasso who is retweeted by Bruce Arthur, says it's worth re-upping these numbers given the discussions surrounding how much more we ought to accommodate the vocal minority who refuse to be vaccinated. These people are always carrying on about minorities. Oh, minorities are the best, absolute best, far better than Canadians. But suddenly, we don't like minorities anymore, and we shouldn't tolerate them anymore. Again, malignancy. So at a time when Ontario hospitals are in an unprecedented crisis, the Ford government's media proxy is working overtime finding ways to implicitly target hospitals and healthcare workers. Going after the OHA specifically provides him plausible deniability for the task. This is from Christy CCK. Oh, and she's got 3 jabs, 3 little jabs next to her name. She calls herself a learner anti-racist. Former FLAC, Gardner, slightly less concussed, equity in education, dyslexia, and Horn of Africa. Yeah, okay. So what was it that caused this? Anthony Fury of the Toronto Sun had tweeted, always keep in mind that the Ontario Hospital Association is not an expert medical group, and Anthony Dale OHA is not a doctor medical voice. It is an industry association, lobbying outfit. Their strategic plan highlights how their main job is advocacy and to influence public policy. And Bruce Arthur chimes in, this is malignant. Malignant, again with the medical metaphors, again with the eliminationist language. What do you do with something, malignant like a tumor? Well, you cut it out, don't you? Oh, I mentioned this fellow at SFU with the odd name. He is a Google scholar. Oh, well, that's certainly authoritative, isn't it? And, okay. Let's see if Ace of Spades has anything to do. Oh, this is funny. This is from the Babylon Bee. After seeing latest job reports, nation regrets Buffalo guy's failure to seize presidency. Again, something's got to give. Something has got to give. If the 20% in Canada hold firm, then the government, is the Canadian government or the provinces going to set up concentration camps? Are they? Media observers, court appears poised to strike down Brandon's vaccine mandates on large employers, but might uphold his mandate on healthcare workers. And, Ted Cruz. He apologized before Tucker Carlson. It wasn't having any of it and threw it back in his face saying, I don't believe you. And it would have been better for him not to go on Tucker Carlson. As even the left-wing media and political figures demand that teachers go back to work, teachers say, F you, it's summer vacation for us forever. Okay, and let's check in Australia. And a happy Christmas to all of my Orthodox viewers. This is from Francis Martel at Breitbart. Australian police banned the very Reverend Proto-Presbyter Stavrofor Milorad Lonkar, a member of the Serbian Orthodox clergy in Melbourne, Friday, from visiting detained tennis star Novak Djokovic, outraging Serbs around the world. Australian Border Force detained Djokovic, the top-ranked tennis player in the world, and tied for most Grand Slam titles in men's tennis history this week upon his arrival to Melbourne on the grounds that he had not received doses of a Chinese coronavirus vaccine product. Djokovic posted on social media prior to his detention that he'd received an unspecified exemption from the vaccine mandate in the country, but authorities denied that this was the case. Reports suggested that Tennis Australia, the organization responsible for hosting the Australian Open, had informed Djokovic that he had received an exemption, but border officials rejected his Tennis Australia paperwork when he arrived. Djokovic's attorneys appealed a deportation order, resulting in police moving the champion into a notoriously dirty, inhumane facility for refugees until his case receives a hearing Monday. Supporters of Djokovic, many of them fellow Serbs, have organized outside of the refugee center to call for his release, and hundreds gathered in Belgrade on Thursday and Friday to protest Australia's draconian coronavirus policies. Australia is essentially a godless nation now. I would say that based on the data I've seen, that a majority of Australians do not believe in God, and those who are actually members of religious groups, most of them, it's pretty weak tea. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. A second tennis star has suffered a similar fate to Novak Djokovic after her visa was canceled and she was forced to isolate into a quarantine hotel, having thought she had secured a vaccine exemption. And this is Czech doubles star Renata Voráčová has been caught in the same dragnet. David Limbrick MP tweeted, "You have got to be kidding me. What an absolute embarrassment for Australia. There is only one way out of this: end the ridiculous and pointless vaccine requirements and apologize, or this might be the last Australian Open." One might have hoped for a certain solidarity among professional tennis players, but it would appear that, we're not getting it. And this is from the Australian Spectator. James McPherson: "Hating on Novak has become a national sport." The whole country is hating on Novak Djokovic right now because he had the courage to do what most of us did not: stand up for himself. Novak's principal stance has only served to highlight the fact that millions of Australians have allowed themselves to be abused for the past 2 years, and no one wants to admit that. It is far easier to demonize a Serbian millionaire who took a stand than it is to agree that we've been bullied into submission by politicians and health bureaucrats. How else to explain the unhinged reaction to the world #1 tennis player being allowed to defend his Australian Open title? And how else to understand the glee with which his subsequent visa rejection was greeted? When news broke earlier this week that Novak was going to be allowed to play in Australia, a Victorian journalist tweeted, quote, "If we have crowds at the Australian Open by the time it starts, it's the duty of every Australian to boo Novak relentlessly between heads. Shit is absolutely effed," unquote. This is from someone called Max Steenkampf, who is a reporter for the Shepparton News. And who else do we have? Back to the Spectator article. Urging 14,000 people under the Rod Laver roof to exhale in unison to protest an airborne virus is the kind of dumb you can only be when you're smack bag in the middle of a rabid mob. Not to be outdone, a Melbourne journalist tweeted that the Australian Open was a tournament fans were scared to come to in the first place and won't want to attend now. This is from John Ralph, who is AFL football journalist with the Herald Sun. Really, says the Spectator, people were scared that the medically cleared Grand Slam winner might walk onto a fenced-off court, cough during a rally, and infect everyone in the stadium with the plague? Get a grip. He's a tennis player, not the Grim Reaper. No one seriously believes Novak is a health risk, and no one seriously believes that kicking him out of the country is protecting Australians. Australia recorded more than 60,000 COVID cases in the past 24 hours. I've been saying for the longest time that this zero COVID policy is totally bonkers. And it's coming. It's going to come to Australia, and it did. It's going to come to New Zealand, and it has. And they have just got more hysterical each time. It's not like Novak, someone who is perfectly healthy and who has natural immunity from having beaten the virus earlier, was going to ruin Melbourne's mythical COVID-0 utopia. Novak's crime was to have insisted that a person's medical information should be private, something we all believed as recently as 2018. He then successfully argued his case before an independent panel of 6 doctors, as well as the Victorian Health Department. As a result, He was cleared to ply his trade as a free man with a clean bill of health. You see the problem here, don't you? Novak kept his medical history private while we all agreed to flash our medical history to a stranger in exchange for the right to enter Kmart. Novak fought for and won the right to earn a living on his own terms while we all consented to making a series of unending injections a condition of being able to earn a livelihood. Damn. Novak probably wouldn't have agreed to a 9 p.m. curfew. He probably wouldn't have forbidden his children from visiting playgrounds. And he probably wouldn't have missed out on precious time with family because an unelected, unrepresentative bureaucrat said science. Novak probably would have stood up to all that nonsense, and now we hate him for it. We have to hate him. If Novak is not the devil, then we were all fools. Fools for acquiescing to an increasingly nonsensical set of demands, and fools for agreeing to endlessly shift COVID goalposts. Novak's Australian Open entry did not mean that we had all been played by politicians. It was Novak who was the problem, not the tyrannical rules to which we so meekly submitted, rules that made us so angry because Novak refused to be enslaved beside us. It wasn't fair. Why should Novak resist when we had not? He should be booed. He should be boycotted. He should get sick with COVID. At least that's what some people seriously suggested, whilst claiming they were concerned about public health, of course. On and on it went, vitriol heaped upon disdain, piled upon contempt. The project's Peter Hellier tweeted, Margaret Court relieved she won't be the most unpopular person at Rod Laver Arena this year. And who's Peter Hellier when he is at home? Oh, okay. Well, he doesn't seem to identify himself. Margaret Court is arguably the greatest female tennis player ever. But she's a religious woman, and she's a Christian, and she doesn't approve of homosexuality, with the result that she has become an unperson in her home country, native country of Australia. Leaving aside the fact that using the story of Novak's medical exemption as an excuse to kick a 79-year-old woman did Hellier no favors, how do we explain Hellier's assertion that Novak, who has harmed no one and has broken no law, is suddenly the most reviled person in the country? Rules are rules, Prime Minister Scott Morrison insisted when announcing to the baying Twitter mob that Novak's visa had been cancelled. Most of us just thought it was good of the Prime Minister to finally show up for something, but I digress. Our strong border policies have been critical to Australia having one of the lowest death rates in the world from COVID. We are continuing to be vigilant, he said. Vigilant in what? Protecting a COVID-ravaged populace from a healthy man with natural immunity? One suspects it might have something more to do with the fact that there is an election coming up, and it suits to have an unpopular foreigner upon whom to focus community anger. Novak's real crime was to have stood up for himself, and in doing so, exposed our cowardice. Don't think of Novak as a tennis player who got special privileges. He did not. And don't think of Novak as a selfish athlete who is disrespecting Australia. He is not. Think of Novak as a mirror in whom we saw an unflattering reflection of ourselves. Our first response was to smash the mirror. Then we cheered that the mirror was to be marched onto a plane and sent back to where it had come from. But there is no escaping what we have seen of ourselves or the bad luck that's sure to come with breaking that mirror. Again, that's James McPherson at The Spectator Australia, which is spectator.com.au. And, let's move on to France. Breitbart, this is from Breitbart London, actually from Associated Press. French President Emmanuel Macron maintained Friday his rude remarks about the country's minority of vaccine refusers, saying he cannot accept them infringing on others' freedom. The 44-year-old outspoken president, who is expected to seek re-election later this year, made headlines earlier this week by using the word murder, rooted in the French word for crap and meaning to rile or to bug. He was talking about a strategy for pressuring vaccine refusers to get coronavirus jabs. His vulgar language dominated news broadcast and provoked angry reactions from his political rivals. Speaking in a news conference in Paris, Macron acknowledged the term may have upset some, but said he takes full responsibility for it. Quote, when some make from their freedom a motto, not only do they put others' lives at risk, but they are also curtailing others' freedom. That I cannot accept. When you are a citizen, you must agree to do your civic duty. Yeah, how about telling that to France's Muslims and other Africans? How about telling them that? I don't think that he would dare. And chaos in French Parliament. France's Parliament approves Macron's health pass to exclude unvaccinated citizens from basic aspects of life. The bill will now proceed to the Senate. MPs Francois Boulejon and Alexis Corbière almost came to blows during a suspension in the National Assembly following remarks by Macron. You know, some of us have been saying for years that our elites hate our guts. Can anyone doubt that now? Paul Joseph Watson from Summit News reports Austria is forcing skiers to wear face masks outdoors as it follows other European countries in bolstering draconian COVID restrictions in response to Omicron. From Saturday onwards, face masks must be worn outdoors when social distancing of 2 meters cannot be maintained. The rule changes are in response to a surge in Omicron cases. Meanwhile, Austria will also begin deactivating the validity of COVID passes after 6 months in an effort to force everyone to get the booster shot. The so-called green passes will expire following a person's last dose from February, with this period having been reduced from 9 months. The announcement was made days after people who have had only 1 dose of the vaccine lost all their green card privileges. Well, you remember that joke from months ago about the mRNA vaccines becoming Netflix for your arm? Well, fully vaccinated. No, you're not. You need another shot. Okay, now I'm fully vaccinated. No, you're not. You need another shot. I mean, what are they going to make this monthly? Like Netflix? Weekly, perhaps? And, okay. Let's go to the chat before I go to Steve Kirsch. And what do we have here? Moral outrage. Well, Prophet says, wait till 5 bugs manifest simultaneously. William Hicks says, there they go again, using that word rules. Fully vaccinated is magical thinking, says Dan. Wouldn't these people be the most valuable ever in a pandemic? People giving them literally whatever they want, says Tom Anderson. Berenson is also pro-choice, as per Rogan podcast, says Walrus Libertarian. Tom Anderson says, KMG, how do people not see how contradictory the words and actions are? We're supposed to be in the middle of a Black Plague 2.0, yet doctors and nurses are fired for vax refusal. Palcasso 88 says Sidney Poitier was the first affirmative action movie star. I don't think that is true at all. Sidney Poitier was a fine actor. I've seen him in many, many movies. Of course, ironically, he was later attacked in the last few years because he seemed like too much of a decent man on screen. Yes, really. He wasn't nasty enough. Although didn't he make some movie about Harlem gangsters, I recall, an attempt to shake his image. David Roy says, more from Berenson. There, the truth, as far as I can tell, and from my limited reporting in late 2020 to chase potential election fraud, would seem then and now to be a fantasy. Yes, I saw that. Okay. I don't, that doesn't bother me particularly. I don't expect people to agree with me about everything. Who else do we have? Zen Master says, I've been using that argument when asked if I'm vax medical information is private. Hello to Tim Humphreys. Okay, there's an election coming in May here. It should be interesting. Well, there's so many political parties in Australia. Is there anything like a Liberty Party? Because, given the weird form of voting that they have there, it's possible for, pressure group parties to get political representation, which is not possible under first past the post. Of course, first past the post is best. Okay. Proportional representation, where parties decide who your elected representatives are, is no, it's not a good thing. And under proportional representation, the same people stay in power forever, which means that corruption is endemic. I mean, even higher levels of corruption. If you want examples of that, you can look at the three I's: Ireland, Italy, and Israel. Steve Kirsch, I'm really enjoying his Substack. We can't depend on the U.S. Supreme Court to figure this out. Scottish is not a court that finds fact, they just opine on the law. Good thing we don't depend on them for finding the facts. Welcome to the new normal, 13-year-olds dying from cardiac arrest. Australia shows the world the wrong way to keep the virus under control. It's hard to find a country that takes COVID more seriously than Australia. Their strict protocols are producing extraordinary results. Spoiler alert, I'm being sarcastic. They're super strict about COVID, with measures that include 1, mandatory vaccinations, 2, mandatory mask use, 3, requiring the unvaccinated isolated home, 4, density limits at indoor areas of hospitality venues and nightclubs, 5, free booster doses are available to everyone 18 years and over who've had their second dose of a primary dose course of COVID-19 vaccination at least 4 months ago, and 6, mandatory electronic check-ins. Note that these measures vary by what state you are in. Almost everyone is vaccinated, but extraordinarily bad results. And it is really fun, to see a chart that goes along like this, and then it goes like that, literally. That's what it looks like. Currently infected, 287,637. That it is, Omicron has just exploded in Australia. Pfizer advice to the Australian people: keep it up. Do not ask any questions. Do not question the outcomes. Your government knows best. How the Australian government spins the results: see, it works. Those numbers would be so much worse if you hadn't followed our advice. They are gaslighting you. How the people feel about this: the government's asked for 2 weeks to flatten the curve 90 weeks ago. Melbourne, Victoria, then picked up the dubious honor of becoming the most locked down city on the globe. At times, the anti-terrorist squad was out on the streets firing rubber bullets and tear gas at people standing on street corners, simply saying they had been locked up long enough. The audacity of these people. Tens of thousands of family businesses have been destroyed, family homes lost, and our population's mental health devastated, along with our happy-go-lucky culture. Highly effective early treatment drugs were banned, hydroxychloroquine, and then that one I can't mention, with the stated reason that they would discourage Australians from getting the vaccination. Forced vaccinations are the norm, with few exceptions being granted, even to those who suffered terribly from their first jab. The government set their ranges: 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%. They were reached just as the target was increased yet again. 90 weeks on, and the curve has gone through the roof. All this damage, all for nothing. The salt in the wound is this was also obviously foreseeable, yet all the fools in government, along with all their medical experts, are in shock. And guess what? More of the same BS is on the way. If you were looking to help the virus infect people, few countries on earth do it better than Australia. They have gone from virtually no COVID cases to a meltdown of cases. I think it is only a matter of time before the world adopts all of the Australian countermeasures. Hospital tacitly admits that their vaccination mandate was never about patient safety. That's from Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, just published a paper that admits that VAERS is underreported by at least 6.5 times. How about that? How about that, eh? This is a paper from the CDC, December 31st, 2021. Brought to my attention, Steve Kirsch writes, by Dr. David Weissman. It was written by the authors from the CDC and FDA, so you can trust it. Yes, 4.5 times. The paper tries to make you believe that the rate of myocarditis for this age group were only 11 cases and 8 million doses. Now contrast that with the 1 in 70 rate of myocarditis actually experienced at the Monte Vista Christian School, a private school near where I live. They want you to believe the rate is 1 in 363,000 fully vaccinated kids. What we see in real life is as high as 1 in 70. And one more from him. Teeny tiny number of adverse reactions. Oh, really? Steve Kirsch writes, on the December 24th, 2021 release of the VAERS data, we passed an important milestone. Over 1 million adverse events reported in VAERS. Oddly, the mainstream media didn't cover this at all. I can't figure out why. Well, because, the planted axiom. The drug is efficacious, highly efficacious, and also incredibly safe. Now, we have decreed this. This is the argument from authority. So don't you dare disagree. Aaron Siri, this is reported by Kane at Citizen Free Press. Aaron Siri tweets, I'm pleased to report that a federal judge rejected the FDA's request to produce the Pfizer COVID vaccine at 500 pages per month and instead ordered a rate of 55,000 pages per month. How about that? FDA had asked a court for 75 years to release documents related to the Pfizer mRNA injection. 75 years. We'll all be dead by then. Jim Kunstler has a column this morning, When That Old Mojo Stops Working, which you're actually seeing in the rhetorical hoo-ha over the January 6th Capitol riot as the main cattle prod driving mob madness, fear of COVID-19 losing its power to terrorize the public. The Party of Chaos put on a grand opera of lamentation Thursday to celebrate its unity and victimhood. We was so traumatized by the riot. But in the background, they can see their dear dream of total vaccination and total control of the population fade in the winter mists. This is the crisis of a managerial class that has lost its ability to manage anything, including all of us, thus the hysteria in the blue precincts of America, where they are concentrated. And as I've averred before, the madness probably has its roots in the slow-motion train wreck of our techno-industrial economy. The managerial class can surely sense it and see it coming, but they don't have a clue what to do about it. So in desperate need of some signifying ritual, they're left performing a grand-scale Chinese fire drill like drunken sophomores of yore, a flurry of pointless, attention-seeking activity. Kunstler continues, you see, this total vaccination fantasy is meant to compensate for that inability to govern in a time of epic turbulence. It provides an illusion of control. But the obvious insanity of it stands out in the demonstrable facts that the vaccinations don't work and that they are racking up an impressive record of harming people. These two facts must be ignored by the vax-happy blue team, even as the immunizing and pretty harmless Omicron variant spreads speedily across the land, conferring superior natural immunity on those who survive it, which is functionally everyone. The virus looks like it's on that old exit ramp, but the disintegrating economy will still be with us, and no amount of political degeneracy disguised as virtue will stop it. We still have to manage our lives individually and collectively going through it. It's going to be a tough slog. The federal government in its current iteration is looking more like an impediment than a help to any of us. Its current hysterical flounderings send a clear message. You can't depend on us to do anything right. Instead, select a favorable place to plant your flag and figure out what you can do locally to rebuild some means of productive activity, fortify basic institutions of law, public safety and money, and restore credible authority. You will have to be nimble and resourceful. The COVID lockdowns of the past 2 years have destroyed many small businesses, and think of that as the tide going out before the blowback of a tsunami that will sweep away large businesses next. It's an issue of scale. The broken giants will have to be replaced by lower scale systems for producing stuff, moving it, and selling it. That includes food, especially, by the way. How are you going to be part of that where you live? What role can you imagine yourself in? What are you good at? What do you dream of being good at? Can you assemble a social network for yourself? Do you have any ability to look after the public interest? Can you speak coherently? Do you mean what you say? Are you grounded morally in right and wrong? Can others depend on you to keep your word? These are the questions that will matter going forward, not whether you are vaccinated or voted for Mr. Trump. It looks like the disorders of economy and community are heading to center stage as the COVID-19 melodrama closes down. Since human nature is perverse, the current mass formation psychosis may transfer its energy onto new hobgoblins. But the mass of Americans, putting aside blue and red insignia for a moment, might simply be tired of lunacy. They may even begin to show impatience with those who generate it, for instance, the cable TV news channels. Some of the most practiced conveyors in lunacy are heading out the door in the months ahead. Joy Reid of MSNBC is reportedly on her way off camera, not by choice. And a while back, the redoubtedly dishonest Rachel Maddow announced her exit for April of this year, probably in anticipation of all her beloved narratives falling apart. Even our earnestly malicious Dr. Fauci is backpedaling furiously, perhaps hearing the bloodhounds of justice yapping out in the gloaming. This week, he finally admitted that half the hospital cases of COVID were actually some other illnesses with the label COVID slapped on, in effect to bribe corrupt hospital managers with big wads of federal subsidy money for using the killer drug remdesivir and intubating hapless COVID victims. Sounds like a racket a little bit, but then the word racket defines the totality of Fauci's career. The decisions he made about banning early treatment of COVID and suppressing information about cheap and effective drugs in the service of preserving the emergency use authorization and the concomitant liability shield for his deadly vaccines arguably led to, well, I can't say that. If he doesn't live to see prosecution, bear in mind that he had plenty of deputies and associates throughout the public health agencies carrying out that policy who deserve to spend some time in courtrooms. Jim Kunstler concludes, meanwhile, the prudent will save their energy to get through the rigors ahead and make plans for a changed economic landscape that will require all the classical virtues they can muster for creating a life worth living. Well, you know, there have been declinists and disasterists among us for some time. Now, there always have been, but this has picked up a great deal of activity, especially after 2008. So I've asked myself the question, you know, if worse comes to worse, what could I do? And I thought, political demagogue. I think I could do that. And let's see if there's anything new here. Oh, okay. This is from Eugippius, who writes, because of my reduced Christmas posting schedule, I missed the UK HSA Week 51 report, so I owe you, loyal readers, a few graphs. First, cast us back to week 50. And yes, where we see that in case rates, we see the Novaks being crushed by the vaccinated, all but under 18. And in, at the time, remember, we were preoccupied by the effect of booster doses in restoring positive efficacy for the 60-plus crowd. Meanwhile, younger age brackets were sliding ever deeper into negative territory. For context, between November 15th and December 12th, Omicron still accounted for no more than a minority of infections in the UK. The week 51 numbers, where the 4-week running averages shifted just 1 week later, look vastly different. This must be a combination of pre-holiday testing and Omicron, which by December 19th was surging towards 40% of all infections in Britain. The latest data from the 2022 Week 1 report that dropped yesterday reveal an even more pronounced pattern, with negative efficacy returning to every age bracket over 18. How about that? Negative efficacy. What that means is it's not simply efficacious is a fancy medical term for saying that something works the way that it's supposed to. Negative efficacy means that, say, a medical treatment not only doesn't work, it makes it worse. For what it's worth, the UK HSA tests negative control investigation of vaccine effectiveness against symptomatic Omicron infection, where vaccination rates in PCR negatives are compared to vaccination rates in PCR positives, finds that vaccine effectiveness in the double dose does not fade below zero. Their latest analysis includes 170,000 Delta cases and 204,000 Omicron cases. As the Health Security Agency loves to tell us, their numbers showing negative efficacy are unadjusted and doubtless unreliable because there's no way of knowing the precise size of the unvaccinated population. Nevertheless, it seems clear by now that negative efficacy is real. It looks like the more you test, regardless of symptoms, the more you find it. This would be why it emerges so strongly in pre-Christmas testing when millions of perfectly healthy people got tested to know whether it was safe to see their elderly relatives. This would also be why the effect is missing from the UK HSA test negative control numbers, which look only at people who sought out testing because of illness. And 60-day death numbers by vax status. And yes, how about that? 80 plus, it's just vax is crushing Novak. 70 to 79, crushing. 60 to 69, crushing it. It's ahead in 50 to 59 and slightly behind in 40 to 49, 30 to 39. How about that? How about that? Everything that we said was true. We were mocked as purveyors of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theorists, racists, misogynists, possibly murderers. Everything that we said was true turned out to be true. Everything they said to be true turned out to be false. And this from Alex Berenson. Has COVID vaccine efficacy turned negative? Data from highly vaccinated countries suggests strongly that the answer is yes. Vaccinated people are at higher risk of infection from Omicron. Denmark, yes, I touched on this yesterday. Berenson posted 6 hours ago. Sounds like the New York Times is telling its readers the Biden OSHA vaccine mandate is going down. I know the liberal judges still seem to have no idea that the vaccines don't end infection or transmission, but they aren't the majority. Well, that's good news, right? And let's take a look at this here. The appeal to non-authority fallacy. An excerpt from Everything You Believe Is Wrong. This is from William Briggs. And it's an excerpt from his book, Everything You Believe Is Wrong. Every kid learns that what seems to be but isn't the appeal to authority fallacy early when he asks, why should I? And is told, because I said so. Only this isn't a proper fallacy because kids should listen to and honor their parents. And because parents, besides having authority over their children, typically know what's best for them, what's best in the command but unspoken. What's best is in tacit premises behind the father's because, which turns what might be a fallacy into wisdom. People are fooled by this simple fallacy, but they're just as easily disabused of it when it is pointed out. Because of this, there is no chapter in this book specifically devoted to the appeal to authority. There is another far better reason for skipping it, though. That is the existence of a far worse, far more pernicious, and far more destructive fallacy, which is akin to the appeal to authority. This is the appeal to non-authority fallacy. I shiver when thinking of it. No fallacy is good, of course, but not all fallacies are equal in their pestilential powers. The ultimate fallacy has the worst individual consequences, but the appeal to non-authority is the most annoying. Modern advertising, and more depressingly, our entire media and government apparatus relies on and seeks out this fallacy. We could even say it is worshipped. In my Stats 101 class notes, Breaking the Law of Averages, I asked this chapter 1 homework question. Stanford Financial took out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal with a picture of golfer Vijay Singh, listing his enormous number of tournament wins with the words Vijay means victory. Given this evidence, what is the probability Stanford Financial won't lose money on your investment? The obvious answer is that you can't know. Singh's golfing prowess is irrelevant, inconsequential, incidental to whether gambles, i.e. investments with Stanford Financial, will lose or win you money. Logically, they may as well have touted my golf scores or yours. They may as well have, in their ad, featured a pretty actress and printed the words, "This is a pretty actress and we are Stanford Financial." The logical content would be the same, which is to say, it would have none at all. Singh, God bless him, is a non-authority on financial matters. Listening to him, as it were, on investments, because he is an authority in some sport, is insane. Beer commercials use the same ploy with beautiful girls, although everyone knows beautiful girls have nothing to do with fermented rice. Some breweries still use barley and hops. The technique works and does sell beer. Well, the Wall Street Journal is aimed at well-educated elites, and golf is a rich man's game, which proves that even those who think themselves sophisticated, well-educated, are as prone to the fallacy as unlettered beer swillers. Our culture worships celebrity and has done for quite some time, at least a few generations, so that we no longer see it as odd or unsightly. It is strange, this worship, and a sure sign of decadence. Lieutenant General Sir John Bagot Glubb, the respected founder and feared of the famed Arab Legion, wrote an essay now remembered only by a few, entitled The Fate of Empires, in which he discovered a common end to civilizations. Quote, the heroes of declining nations are always the same: the athlete, the singer, or the actor. The word celebrity today is used to designate a comedian or a football player, not a statesman, a general, or a literary genius, unquote. In the latter half of the 9th century, the cultured remnant in Baghdad, Glubb said, commented bitterly on the extraordinary influence acquired by popular singers over young people, resulting in a decline in sexual morality. Pop singers accompanied their erotic songs on the lute, and much obscene sexual language came increasingly into use. The singers were often banned, but just as often returned. Sound familiar? If not, then look at the lyrics of today's most popular songs. Listen to the music. All of attributes discovered by Glubb are shared in our declining age. Except it's worse with us because we have invented the category famous for being famous. Singing and running with a ball requires at least talent, but being noticed requires nothing except the ability for self-promotion, which we reward with all manner of riches and attention. That we listen and heed these mush-minded non-entities on any matter is, I consider, sufficient proof of our impending doom. Again, that's an excerpt from William Briggs' book, and his website is at wmbriggs.com. This is again from Kane at Citizen Free Press. A showdown in public or in a hospital ward between a British doctor and the health minister of Britain, Sajid Javid. Doctor tells health minister the science isn't strong enough to enforce mandatory vaccination. Dr. Steve James, currently unvaccinated and working as a consultant anaesthetist at the King's College Hospital in London, told Javid that he has had COVID-19, has the antibodies for COVID-19, and has been working safely with patients since the beginning of the pandemic. Dr. James was working on the intensive care unit when Javid asked him his thoughts on Britain's new rules requiring vaccinations for NHS workers. James replied, quote, I'm not happy about that. I had COVID at some point. I've got antibodies, and I've been working on COVID ICU since the beginning. I've not had a vaccination. I do not want a vaccination. The vaccines are reducing transmission only for about 8 weeks for Delta. With Omicron, it's probably less. And for that, I would be dismissed if I don't have a vaccine. The science isn't strong enough, unquote. Javid attempted to provide a reply, but completely ignored James's comment regarding the lack of scientific evidence to support a vaccine mandate. Javid instead fell back on opinions, saying, I respect that, but there are also many different views. To this, James suggested that Javid, a former banker who also opposed Brexit, should nuance the rules to allow those who have naturally derived antibodies should not be required the vaccine, saying, the protection that I've got from transmission is probably the equivalent to someone who is vaccinated. And as this was caught on camera, this was quite embarrassing for Javid. Finally, on this subject, we're going to go to Lockdown Skeptics for a roundup of dailyskeptic.org. School issues detentions for pupils who fail to wear masks. I thought we weren't doing detentions anymore because it was racist or something. Okay. So, we've already touched on that. COVID ICU occupancy is less than a quarter of its peak last January and declined further in the past 2 days. Time to declare the pandemic over. Yes, when we hear about, let's say, statistics from Canadian provinces, how many ICU beds, this is rather contextless for this reason. It's winter now, and it's cold and wet. And people stay indoors, so they have more contact with each other than they would. It's known as the cold and flu season. And ICU bed occupancy peaks January, February. So why don't you show us the numbers from a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or more before saying, oh my God, it's an emergency. The hospitals are about to collapse. That would require some work on behalf of journalists, and journalists don't like doing work. Do your genes determine how sick you get from COVID-19? John Collis, a recently retired nurse practitioner, uses the work of Professor Daniel Davis to explore the role of genes in the immune system and asks whether genetic diversity between individuals and groups might explain why some people are worse affected by COVID than others. Mark Drakeford vows to keep draconian restrictions in place as UK's daily COVID cases fall for second day in a row. Forcing children to wear masks is dystopian, says Gruffalo author Julia Donaldson. And schools in chaos, say teaching unions. Golly, I wonder who might be responsible for that chaos. Let's go to the chat here. Oscar Toe says, always a great feeling to get a surgery over. Don Willis says, we'll jog with show folk on the sand, drink a Kirschwasser from a shell, San Francisco show and tell. It's a Steely Dan lyric. What's up with these chatbots, says Oscar Toe. Do we have chatbots? Do we? That doesn't sound good. Okay. Mandates and passports, says Texas Feral Hog. Only in Bonnie and Clyde and 3 Days of the Condor, at least for her look. So we're talking about Faye Dunaway, are we? Okay. I saw a movie. No, actually, I don't know. Maybe it was Twilight Zone episode or Perry Mason or whatever that. Martha Hyer in it. Martha Hyer was in Sabrina, and she was nominated for an Oscar in the Oscar Otto Preminger film. Some Came Running. Just an absolutely gorgeous woman. She never got nowhere near as much attention as Faye Dunaway did. Well, I mean, Martha Hyer could act too. We're ranking blondes now. Sybil Shepherd, number one. Well, yeah, Sybil Shepherd. She's right up there with Julie Christie as far as blondes go. Thank you for your kind words, David Wright. Could KMG be the Caesar we've been waiting for, says Halper. Is Al Sharpton going to be the main face of MSNBC in a year, says something Gameston. Yes, as I never tire of pointing out, MSNBC fired Pat Buchanan because essentially he wrote a book on the Great Replacement and what that means. And they replaced him with Al Sharpton, who actually fomented 2, honest to God, pogroms in New York City. Teleologic Jones says, I think Kunstler has read After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre. Well, that would be a good thing. Let's talk about oikophobia. Oikophobia is, it's a Greek word, and it's been used differently by different people. According to Wikipedia and psychiatric usage, oikophobia may narrowly refer to the fear of the physical space of the home interior. But it has a particular political usage, which was developed by Roger Scruton in his book, England and the Need for Nations. He defined it as the repudiation of inheritance and home. It is a stage through which the adolescent mind normally passes, but that is a feature of some typically leftist political impulses and ideologies that expose xenophilia, that is to say, a preference for foreign cultures. Scruton uses the term as the antithesis of xenophobia. In his book, Roger Scruton, Philosopher on Dover Beach, Mark Dooley describes oikophobia as centered within the Western academic establishment on both the common culture of the West and the old educational curriculum that sought to transmit its humane values. This disposition has grown out of, for example, the writings of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault's assault on bourgeois society, resulting in an anti-culture that takes direct aim at holy and sacred things, condemning them as repudiating them as oppressive and power-ridden. This is a quote from Scruton. Derrida is a classic oikophobe insofar as he repudiates the longing for home that the Western theological, legal, and literary traditions satisfy. Derrida's deconstruction seeks to block the path to this core experience of membership, preferring instead a rootless existence founded upon nothing. And I was thinking about this because I came across this story from The Guardian by Ben Doherty. Oh, why are people carrying on about Novak Djokovic? Because there's a whole bunch of illegal immigrants to Australia who are being treated badly. I don't care, okay? I really don't care. We have a bunch of, I've studied the question of so-called refugees in Canada extensively and written about it extensively. And in the overwhelming number of cases, their claims are bogus, entirely bogus. But it doesn't seem to matter because, these people only want a better life. And so, we should let them come here and occupy space and drive up our rents and prices and also get, free gibs from the government. Get free gibs from the government. So there's this sad story about someone called Mehdi, who goes by only one name, which is in no way suspicious. The easiest way to be accepted as a refugee in Canada is to destroy all your documentation. And there have been cases in Canada where people have been held for years and years because the government can't figure out who they are. Oh, but a sad story from Mehdi, who apparently is a member of he was a child of 15 when he arrived by boat in Australia seeking sanctuary, a member of the persecuted Ahwazi Arab minority in his homeland Iran. How do we know that's true, by the way? His family urged him to flee and arranged for his fraught passage, hoping he might find freedom on the other side of the world. Why the other side of the world? Saudi Arabia is mostly sand, empty, plenty of room for refugees there. Why aren't they taking any? Huh? But the Australian newspapers and the British newspapers have been full of such stories. I don't believe any of their stories. Not one. Not one. But then I came across this, which I found rather shocking, that you might find it shocking as well. Mehdi has been approved for resettlement in the U.S. under Australia's swap arrangement with the United States, the 2016 deal under which America agreed to resettle refugees held offshore by Australia in exchange for Australia accepting Central American refugees from U.S.-run camps. The deal has seen nearly 1,000 refugees resettled, but it has been painfully slow, and the allocation of places appears capricious to those waiting sometimes for years for a spot that may never come. This is lose-lose. This is absolute insanity. Why would Australia want Central American refugees? A bunch of people, I don't know, what do they have? Average IQs 80, 85? They have no education. They have no skills. Many of them cannot even speak Spanish, let alone English. And so people supposedly from Iran or from Sri Lanka, who have bogus stories about mistreatment, who somehow got together the money to travel halfway around the world. Well, of course, America would want that. No, this is oikophobia, pure and simple. There is no other way to describe it. Ryan Landry at the American Sun pointed me this morning to a piece on Substack by Robert Stark, The Prospects for a Viable Non-Leftist California Nationalism. This has to do with, California separatism, Cal-exit, okay? And it struck me reading this that in what sense can California be said to be American anymore? I mean, it is notionally part of America. Stark says, I have a strong California identity with family going back in the state for many generations and have called for California to adopt its own political framework and identity that is different from America's red versus blue politics. However, we need to be honest about California's political reality and the state's many problems, including a declining quality of life, some of the nation's worst income inequality, with a Gini index tied with Mississippi, one of the worst education systems in the nation, and corrupt one-party leadership in Sacramento. Yeah, but who are the people that come to California? Who are the people? According to Tucker Carlson's show, Shankar Singham said, in regard to the middle class leaving, that's actually a good thing. We need these spots opened up for the new wave of immigrants to come up. It's what we do. We're exporting our middle class to the United States. You guys should be thanking us for that. And Substack or Shark believes that Singham was trolling for publicity. I'm not so sure about that. It's a story from 4.5 years ago from the New India Times. Indian American Shankar Singham supports Cal exit from the U.S. An Indian American from California, Shankar Singham, who's vice president of the California Freedom Coalition and is taking a lead in the Cal exit movement, which seeks to have California separate from the United States and declare itself as a separate country, has made some controversial remarks, which has created a buzz in the media and the organization he's associated with. It has been my experience that overwhelmingly people from the Indian subcontinent, they come to Western countries and they cannot wait to announce to the whole world their superiority to the people who have graciously allowed them to live here, and also how much they hate us because we're so mean to them, despite the fact that they have affirmative action and they get all sorts of gibs and they get prizes simply for rent seeking. What sort of people would seek to increase the number of such people coming to our countries? People afflicted with oikophobia. That's who. Increasingly, my own country, Canada, is it's been balkanized. We have all sorts of minorities who are all angry. They hate Canadians. They hate Canada's history. They also increasingly hate each other, leading us to the war of all against all. And of course, we have a prominent fifth column from Communist China as well. This is a story from Steve Chase, the Globe and Mail. I used to work with Steve many years ago at Alberta Report. Two researchers at McGill University say a disinformation campaign against a Conservative Party candidate during the 2021 election race is a disturbing demonstration of how propaganda tactics could be used by hostile foreign actors to interfere with Canada's political system. And they suggest a countermeasure to discourage future disinformation efforts would be a public registry to track foreign influence that is similar to the very mechanism that former BC MP Kenny Chiu was attacked for during the election campaign for proposing. Alternately, we could simply cut off all immigration from China and deport those people who are not citizens. We could do that. Or we could simply have an immigration moratorium for the whole world. Canada is full. We don't need any more people. During the 2021 federal election campaign, Chiu's proposal was condemned on Chinese language social media, alleging his plan would suppress the Chinese community in Canada. These comments were disseminated on apps and websites widely used by some Canadians of Chinese origin, who make up approximately half of his riding's population. Yeah. So now we have Communist China increasingly dominating many electoral ridings in Canada. Gibbs, and more Gibbs. Implementation will be key to First Nation child welfare agreement, says advocate. Agreement in principle will see $40 billion. There's an error in the subhead there. Yes, $40 billion between the federal government and First Nations. Oh, it's a big step in the direction for reconciliation, according to Cindy Blackstock, but she's still waiting to see action. The non-binding agreement sets aside $20 billion for compensation for young people harmed by Canada's discriminatory child welfare system and $20 billion for the long-term reform of the ongoing child welfare system. Compensation will be made available to First Nations people on reserve who were removed from their homes as children between April 1st, 1991 and March 31st, 2022, as well as those who were removed by the Yukon Child Welfare Authority during the same time period. Why were they removed? Because their home lives were hellish. That's why they were removed. This is one of Canada's biggest scandals, the state of child rearing amongst so-called Indigenous people. But of course, the media is not going to talk about that. And of course, they would never get into the question of sexual abuse in Native Indian households. And do you know that Canada is on the verge of being overrun by Nazis? Yes. 3 people at the CBC had to come up with this story. Infiltrator wanted to kneecap a violent neo-Nazi group. I was in the right place at the right time, anti-fascist activist says. Golly, I wonder how he got to be in the right place at the right time. Recordings made by an anti-fascist activist who was not named, who infiltrated the base. Patrick Matthews can be heard discussing how he would conduct a paramilitary training event in Michigan, teaching members of the organization skills he had learned in the Canadian Army. Oh, this fellow calls himself Tradian, as an anti-fascist activist who infiltrated the base. How he managed to be accepted by them. Typically, they look for some sort of gesture of good faith. You know, all gangs do this. But then the story takes a predictable turn. So infiltrated. Infiltrated by how many people? By the time Tradian walked away from the group, FBI undercover agents were also on the inside, posing as members. As always, it's feds all the way down. And I'm going to go to the book club shortly. I want to comment on, before I do, and I'll go back to the chat before I do that as well. I want to comment on an amusing essay by Hank Oslo at the American Sun yesterday. The real January 6th was the friends we made along the way. No one believes the United States Congress is legitimate. As a group, they are universally despised. This is not a novel circumstance. There hasn't been a day since 1800 or so when a double-digit percentage of the population didn't prefer a double-digit percentage of Congress erected on the trees conveniently planted mere yards away on the National Mall. Their congressman is, of course, wonderful for helping them out with their VA pension and so on. Their approval rating is lower than that of HIV. This is for a good reason. Notoriously corrupt and ineffectual, their primary role is channeling the grift that a $6.6 trillion federal budget can provide, not counting the Federal Reserve's formally unlimited resources, which lack even the pretense of political control or compliance mandates enforced on a putatively private sector, and taking, all things considered, a modest commission for their services. Pelosi gets top billing because of her relative lack of subtlety, but a plurality of the institution is on the take on various levels. That merely accounts for the financial corruption. No one who has met a living, breathing legislator is under the misapprehension that they are a big man squeezing out their cut like Tony Soprano. Their take is, for the most part, the equivalent to a doorman's shiny Christmas tip. They keep things running smoothly, but everyone is aware they are ultimately disposable, which is why there is a marked lack of shock when it turns out they have self-destruct buttons embedded in their careers and are selected to begin with for pliability. Ultimately, they do as they are told or are replaced. Encountering an angry mob, then, should be treated as a natural entitlement of the position, like a mailman occasionally encountering a snarling dog. This is why they make the big bucks, serving as a physical locus of disdain so the people actually running the country don't have to trouble themselves with the banalities of legislation. Also entailed in the position is hysterical cowardice or histrionic fantasizing about their role in a drama orchestrated for the benefit of the viewing public. Thus, we have the spectacle of an utter humiliation, where a ragtag group of unarmed, unorganized, angry, and mostly peaceful protesters with a completely inchoate agenda nevertheless displayed more spine than the avatars of national political power, who they sent scurrying, fart-masked into rat tunnels to await instructions on when and how they should vote. The fact that it was a bunch of rope-line-respecting costume yahoos made it that much more bitter. This wasn't Channing Tatum and a crew of Spetsnaz mercs synchronizing their watches for the big job. It wasn't even the secret police waving guns in their face at 3 a.m., another occupational hazard that statistically 20 or so of them have to look forward to. Aside from the horror in the tunnel, a good portion of the footage could be set to yakety sax. The two responses to this sort of humiliation tend to be to memory hole it or go full revanchism. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was at least partially motivated by and rewarded because of the humiliation of their sack of Rome 350 years prior. Never again. Who's vague victizing now? It's clear what path Congress and the institutional left have chosen. The sanctity of the blessed temple of democracy is at stake. They trod their unwashed feet upon Dennis Hastert's favorite wrestling mat. If the demonstrators are insufficiently threatening on their face, they must be inflated until the story becomes a temporary failing against a terrible danger rather than the beclowning of a widely hated institution. You cannot reason your way out of this dynamic. Reason implies cunning, which merely heightens the jeopardy they pretend to be in unless they crush the hated rubes. The danger is further exacerbated by the fact that the entire ordeal was spiritually, if not tactically, initiated by Trump, whose signature move was allowing his supporters to acknowledge how much they hated various slices of the governing elites by pointing out how much the elites hated them. Who else could inspire such a volume of men to assemble, let alone storm the Capitol, let alone without him asking? What should happen if, next time he asks? They cannot possibly reconcile with such a threat. Conversation is impossible. How then to respond? The second best thing to revanchism is spite. The idea that January 6th was some kind of right-wing coup is ridiculous. The opposite, not so much. The idea that such a response would have been richly deserved in response to the November 3rd, I can't say that. It's quite defensible, language of the unheard and all that. If the left wants to claim as their enemy anyone who questions the honor of the Milwaukee Election Commission or the Ways and Means Committee, the right should be happy to join hands on that basis. So let's go to the chat. Oh, we're talking about Jane Fonda now, are we? Clute is a strange movie, says Anran. I mostly liked it, but felt that I was missing the point somehow. Well, apparently it's about valorizing sex workers. I saw a discussion of this on one of those nostalgia movie channels that I had. They had whatever, like 1971, a year in film. They had it for various years. They were pretty good, actually. But Clute, all these feminists were drooling about it. Ooh, sexy Jane Fonda is just a take-no-nonsense sex worker. And isn't that great? Because sex work is not only real work, it's honorable work. Jane Fonda, let's see, when did she reach her peak? Barbarella, I think. It's a silly movie, but Jane Fonda looks, wow, pretty outstanding. Speaking of that movie, I was reading the college site. Kevin doesn't talk about it anymore, and saw the head guy there trashing It's a Wonderful Life. He is smart, but also dead wrong. Okay. Yeah, I read the piece. I go there every day. I wrote a piece about It's a Wonderful Life for Chronicles some years ago. And of course, it's a corny and melodramatic movie, but it is very moving. I have two problems with it. People call it a Christian movie. Well, kind of, sort of. And our hero, James Stewart, problem, it's just money. His problem is solved pretty quickly because there's a whip round for him. And the $8,000 that was stolen by Mr. Potter, well, it's all, it's made whole and more. Oh, if only, all problems in life could be solved by that. Now, the scenes with James Stewart, as his life is falling apart, I think that P-Man underestimates their power. He accuses him of being childish. Well, if you, sacrificed your ambitions for your whole life for people like your idiot Uncle Billy, and you had ended up in a situation where he says, what does he say? He says, disgrace, bankruptcy, prison. Yeah, well, I can understand how he would go a pretty spare. Of course, whenever I watch that movie, and golly, it was free for decades until some studio used a filthy legal trick to reclaim the copyright. Just his outbursts of rage and even hatred against various people Are we supposed to believe that that's going to be forgotten quickly, either by him or by the people who suffered the brunt of his abuse? I don't think so. Susan Oliver. Oh, we're going to be talking about Susan Oliver. Just a gorgeous woman. Absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. We're going to talk about Star Trek. Yeah, let's take gorgeous women and we'll paint them green or whatever. So, yeah, they're aliens. Well, they're just so foreign to us. Yeah, really so foreign. Donna Reed, I mentioned this, I think, on this live stream, that for men of a certain age, you asked the question, perfect movie wife? Well, that would be Donna Reed, wouldn't it? What else do we got here? We're talking, the first time Grace Kelly is seen in Rear Window might be the most erotic moment ever put on film. Extraordinary, says Anne Run. Yeah. Rear Window is one of my favorite movies. It's insight into male psychology. Because a different man, or one might say a lesser man than, James Stewart, Scott, might. Okay, so Grace Kelly, the most beautiful woman in the world, by general account, and just so beautifully dressed. And when she has that meal catered for him from Sardi's or 21 or whatever, I suppose most men are just staring at the screen with their mouth hanging open, thinking, pinch me, I must be dreaming. But that's not what Jimmy Stewart wants. I have a particular life, which involves me, going around the world and often living in considerable discomfort for periods of time and not hanging out with the smart set. And I don't think you're up for it. So he effectively forces her into a position where she risks her life in order to prove that she's worthy to be his wife. Golly, golly, golly. Oscar Toe likes Julie Christie, as do I. Oh, Gene Seberg. In Breathless, when she's hawking newspapers wearing that International Herald Tribune t-shirt, my word. But that's on my bingo card that someone put on Twitter. There's a square for hot women in old movies. I don't think Uncle Billy was an idiot, just nervous and very forgetful. He was a good man. Plenty of idiots are good men. He was an idiot. Grace Kelly was rumored to be going after her married co-stars. Yeah, I've heard that talk for decades. I don't know how true it is or not. Her marriage to, what do they call him? The Prince of Monaco or whatever. That didn't work out too well. That royal family seems to be off the scale, corrupt. I've gone on a little long here, but let's move on to the book club. This is a book published this year by Regnery, and it is called Pandemia. I'm looking at it on Amazon, where it's available both on Kindle and hardcover. And it has a 5-star rating with almost 1,200 ratings. And it sold pretty well, not as well as RFK Jr.'s book, which is considerably cheaper. And it is 157 in all books sold. Number 1 in viral diseases, number 1 in economic policy and development, number 1 in communicable diseases. Let's go to Alex Berence's Twitter entry. Have some fun. Alexander Berenson, born January 6, 1973, is an American writer. He was a reporter for the New York Times and has authored several thriller novels and a book on corporate financial filings. His 2019 book, Tell Your Children, The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence, sparked controversy, earning denunciations from many in the scientific and medical communities. During the coronavirus pandemic, Berenson appeared frequently in American right-wing media, spreading false claims about COVID-19 and its vaccines. He spent much of the pandemic arguing that its seriousness was overblown. Once COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out, he made false claims about the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines. He was a science reporter for the New York Times for almost a decade. He left 12 years ago to become a full-time novelist. Bestsellers, many of them. Oh, he authored the controversial 2019 book, Tell Your Children, that has been denounced as alarmist and inaccurate by many in the scientific and medical communities because of his claims that cannabis causes psychosis and violence. Many scientists state that he is drawing inappropriate conclusions from the research, primarily by inferring causation from correlation, as well as cherry picking data that fits his narrative and falling victim to selection bias via his use of anecdotes to back up his assertions. Oh, anecdotes! Yes, my mother was she didn't believe that the vaccines worked. She thought that they were poison, and so she didn't take the vaccines, and now she's dead of COVID. Message, you all must get the vaccine. Oh, yes, the media just, and even scientific writers, they hate anecdotes. They hate anecdotes. Yeah. On August 28, 2021, Twitter permanently suspended Berenson for repeated violations of its policy on COVID-19 misinformation. The full title of the book is Pandemia, How Coronavirus Hysteria Took Over Our Government, Rights, and Lives. Of course, I've spoken for, dozens of hours about Alex Berenson on this live stream. You know my opinion of him. He's just one of the great men of this decade. No question about it. He begins his book at the very beginning. The hide in the basement, stock up on bottled water, shut down the world. The plague is here. Pandemic made sense, maybe. Within a few weeks, even as the United States and Europe had just begun lockdowns, anyone paying attention could see that the cure was worse than the disease. In our desperation to control COVID-19, we had done more damage to ourselves and the world than the virus ever could. By then, though, it was already too late. This is the true story of how media hysteria, political partisanship, over-reliance on unproven technology, and scientific illiteracy brought the United States and the world to the brink of breakdown. The true story of how we trashed civil liberties we had treasured for generations, how we denied school to our children and destroyed small businesses. The true story of how we locked down and hid our faces from one another on the thinnest possible evidence, of how a public health emergency became big business overnight as governments spent trillions of dollars to fight the coronavirus, and unnecessary lockdowns destroyed small businesses, hugely enriched giant corporations, and forced people off paid employment onto government checks. How we spent a year hiding the risks and overestimating the benefits of vaccines based on a radical new biotechnology, and how we then tried to force the shots on tens of millions of unwilling Americans while censoring those who raised questions about them. All in response to a virus much less dangerous than the Spanish flu, much less Ebola, a virus that is less dangerous to healthy children and young adults than influenza, a virus that does most of its damage to people at or very near the end of their lives, a virus that kills slightly more people worldwide than diarrhea or Alzheimer's in 2020. This is the true story many of you have never heard, not because I have a magic source at the CDC passing me thumb drives with hidden information. The facts that I and a handful of other journalists and skeptics have reported since March 2020 are readily available in government documents and hospital records and scientific papers. No, the facts you're about to read aren't secrets. The secret is in the perspective. For the last 2 years, I've tried to approach COVID-19 and the vaccines for it as I do every story I write as a reporter, looking at evidence with an open mind and evaluating risks realistically. I've tried to compare lockdowns and other COVID policies to previous consensus views on the right way to manage epidemics. Unfortunately, the media, especially the American media, committed early on to portraying the coronavirus as far riskier than it was and the vaccine as safer. Elite outlets like the New York Times went out of their ways to foment panic and ignore positive news. Throughout 2020, many scientific studies offered reassuring data, especially the low-risk SARS-CoV-2 posed to kids and young adults and their safety in schools. Practically everything pointed the same way. Meanwhile, the models that had predicted apocalyptic outcomes proved wrong. Aside from a few bad days in New York City in March and April 2020, American hospitals were never close to being overrun. In fact, they were so empty in the spring of 2020 that many laid off workers. Even in New York, the field hospitals and medical ships went largely unused. But no one seemed to notice, much less care. Instead, the Times, CNN, and the rest fixated on a single number, the count of Americans who had reportedly died from the coronavirus. Cable networks offered real time tallies. The Times ran a special edition when the figure reached 100,000. They never put the figure in context. They never explained that our methods for recording COVID linked deaths were likely producing overcounts, or that even with our aggressive counting, the COVID death figure represented just over 10% of all American deaths in 2020. More important, or most important rather, they never explained honestly that COVID almost exclusively targeted the very old and sick. Instead, they went the other way, searching desperately for outlier cases, the handful of coronavirus deaths of people under 50 without pre existing conditions. Inevitably, they made mistakes, as when the Times called the murder of a 27-year-old Iowa man a COVID death. Reporters are crucial watchdogs against government mistakes and overreach all of government, but the media's hatred for Donald Trump blinded journalists to the power that state governments and unelected scientific and medical advisors wielded as the epidemic unfolded. As COVID hit, governors in many states seized unprecedented control of their citizens. They refused to reopen schools. They imposed draconian rules on businesses. They forced people to wear masks even outside. Journalists didn't question these monumental intrusions. They cheered them while ignoring scientists who challenged the conventional narrative. Hugely powerful social media companies such as Facebook and tech giants such as Google and Amazon went even further. Those corporations blocked videos and books and groups that questioned the value of the lockdowns, from which these same corporations have profited enormously. The social media companies worked with organizations such as the World Health Organization to become quasi-governmental censors. In suppressing honest debate and dissent, they set a dangerous precedent and fed the rise of wilder conspiracy theories. Yet they couldn't silence everyone. This is the true story of how, to my surprise, I became a leading voice calling for an end to lockdowns and a return to normality. How the strange intimacy of celebrity in the age of social media enveloped me. My Twitter follower count grew from 7,000 to 200,000 in months, and then to over 300,000 in 2021. Some people told me I had kept them sane. Others said I was a psychopath who didn't care how many people COVID killed. People followed my feed to get information they couldn't get anywhere else. I tried to source my tweets, offering links to the material I quoted. I wanted my readers to judge for themselves whether I had fairly represented it. I knew I had. I will do the same in this book. I want to be as transparent as possible. But it wasn't the information I offered that made the people love or hate my feed and me. It was my tone, enraged at the lockdowns, prodding, often sarcastic. I didn't treat the epidemic with fear. Instead, I insisted virus gonna virus. I wrote about team reality and team apocalypse. I called masks face diapers and complained of Neils and Karens who wouldn't leave their houses. I created an Orwellian department of Pandemia to announce rules about the thing. Even readers who supported me occasionally told me I was going too far, that I needed to remember that the coronavirus really did kill people. But I believed I needed to speak out in a way that couldn't be ignored. I believed mainstream reporters were offering worst-case scenarios for reasons both economic and political. Panic was good for page views and terrible for Donald Trump. And most reporters at places like the New York Times hate Trump with a passion that can't be overstated. As for me, I'm a registered independent whose politics are that it is impossible to be too cynical. On April 16, 2020, I tweeted against hysteria satire, against storytelling data, against groupthink reporting, against authoritarianism bravery, most of all against millennialism realism and hope, against hysteria satire. And if that satire sometimes cut too deep or went too far, I had to accept the consequences. I can't tell if you are super angry or if you are enjoying yourself, a journalist said to me in June 2020. My answer, why not both? Day by day and hour by hour, the cause of fighting for the truth and against our overreaction to SARS-CoV-2 took over my life. Vanity Fair published 2 hit pieces on me. I went to war with the Times, a newspaper where I had worked for a decade. Old friends stopped speaking to me. Sometimes they publicly attacked me. My marriage staggered under the weight of my Twitter obsession. Most painful of all, my father, who was dying of cancer, grew angry with me for pressing against lockdowns. He accused me of not caring about him. My stance became a subject we couldn't discuss. Until in May 2020, he died, not of COVID, of leukemia. I didn't mourn him properly. My wife was right. My friends were right. I was obsessed. I couldn't stop fighting. Couldn't and wouldn't, can't and won't. because our response to the coronavirus is the worst public policy mistake worldwide in at least a century since World War I, when Europe's leaders sent millions of young men to their graves for reasons they couldn't even explain. A generation after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have run the other way, tearing up human liberty around the world. The people who have caused the panic show no sign of letting up, no sign they plan to let us get back to normal anytime soon, if ever. Yes, lockdowns in the United States have ended, but countries such as Australia and New Zealand show just how fragile our freedoms have become. Meanwhile, we're still suffering from intrusive rules that vary state to state and country to country. Since the beginning of the pandemic, they have included social distancing, mask requirements, school closing, bans on indoor dining, endless testing of college students, aggressive contact tracing, travel restrictions, quarantines for people without symptoms, and now vaccine mandates. Yet despite the enormous cost of these measures, despite their intrusion on our civil liberties, none has been shown to slow the spread of COVID. We have engaged in a game of viral theater at incalculable cost, both real and psychic, particularly to children and teenagers who were denied normal schooling and social interaction. In August 2020, the CDC reported that 25% of adults aged 18 to 24 said they had seriously considered suicide during the month of June. That figure was more than double the percentage who had reported doing so in a similar survey in 2018. These young adults are at essentially no risk from the coronavirus, but we made them terrified for their futures and locked them up to grapple with adolescent angst, drug problems, or depression alone. This is the true story of the pandemia, 1 part pandemic, 5 parts hysteria. Neither shaken nor stirred, but heated in a thermal cycler, also known as a PCR machine, another obscure and complex technology that played a crucial role in bringing us this crisis. The coronavirus epidemic could not have happened a generation ago or a decade ago, but not because of the virus. At the beginning, the very beginning, when the panic made sense, the novel coronavirus seemed special, exceptional. It could lurk for weeks before subtly cutting down its victims, we were told. It spread like the common cold, but killed far more aggressively than influenza, we were told. It colonized the nose and mouth for maximum infectivity before suddenly moving into the lungs for maximum lethality, we were told. But a lot of what we were told wasn't true. We've learned now that SARS-CoV-2 isn't particularly lethal and its contagiousness varies widely in different settings. Most people without symptoms don't spread it much. Really, the novel coronavirus is just a virus. It has one truly unusual symptom. Many infected people temporarily lose their senses of smell and taste. Not exactly Ebola, which has a 50% fatality rate. So what was our response to this rather ordinary virus? Why was it so different from our reaction to any other disease in human history? Because it could be. Because in our foolish brilliance, we have created information technology indistinguishable from magic. We closed offices and schools because we could. We now have the internet bandwidth for white-collar workers to stay home and for students to learn remotely on their computers. We counted and publicized deaths obsessively and still do because we can. We have database software that enables hospitals and health departments to aggregate information in real time. We distribute that information to everyone instantaneously through social and conventional media because we can. We are not just choking on data, we are stuffing it down our throats, yet we are desperate for more each moment. Many of us seem almost addicted to tracking the troll of the coronavirus. We know we should stop, but we can't. We test endlessly for the virus because we can. Polymerase chain reaction PCR machines make the virus's RNA into DNA and that DNA into more DNA. They let us find a single fragment of the virus and multiply it 1 trillion times. 1 trillion is a million, 1,000, 1,000. It is a number no one can really grasp. And the mRNA COVID vaccines created, developed, and put into use worldwide in under a year, faster than almost any other drug or vaccine in history, are only the latest example of our scientific brilliance. But we are playing magic tricks on ourselves. We have forgotten a crucial fact. These medical wonders come at the highest possible price. When we multiply a viral fragment 1 trillion times, we get a positive test result in many people who will never be sick. Then we tell those healthy people that they're ill and we make them, and the people around them stay home. Our magic has made us insane. This is a book of about 450 pages, and it examines, looks at Spanish flu, subsequent outbreaks and how they were treated. And I suppose, oh, yes, and the comparisons inevitable. And quite right comparisons to HIV/AIDS, how science has become politicized. The initial reaction, the hysteria, and how doubling down, despite everything that we have learned, would indicate very strongly that we have been wrong about this from the very beginning. As I say, as I have said, I have an enormous regard for Alex Berenson. He's one of the heroes of this decade, and I couldn't recommend his book more highly. And my word, it is sourced. There's about 100 pages of footnotes here. So this is hardly something written off the top of his head. If you have the means, you should acquire a copy of this book, because it is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book is, is far more political than Berenson's book. Of course, that has its virtues as well. Berenson is far more Joe Friday approach, just the facts, ma'am. Although, of course, he comes to certain conclusions based on his facts. Let's have the final look at the chat. What do you think of the Shawshank Redemption? Asks Amrun. As a teenage revenge fantasy, it's pretty good. That's what I think of it. Yeah, the real murderer just happens to show up in the prison and feel so guilty that he decides to blab about it, which is never going to happen. David Wright says, my daughter-in-law, who had serious lack of taste and smell for most of her life, got it all back in spades after having COVID. Wolf Barney, hello. As the evidence piles up, the shots and lockdowns don't work. The people in charge double down. But of course. Alex's optimism is good for us in a way. He acts as our Steven Pinker, says Gamiston. KMG, thoughts on going from hard copy to ebooks? I used to collect books at one time. I had a library of about 1,500 hardcover books. Many modern first editions. I mean, in literature, many of which were signed as well. I discovered that you can have books or you can move. And if you move, you will lose books. And if you move frequently, you will lose all of your books, which is what has happened to me. So I read exclusively on ebooks now. I don't like to read from the computer. I really don't. Because then you run into the internet problem. Oh, is there something more interesting, exciting happening somewhere else on a tab, right? So I have a, let's see. Oh, it's not here. I have a, what is it called, a Kobo reader. And it's backlit, of course, as they all are, which is nice. And I have a little jacket for it so you can prop it up in bed. So I don't have to read like this, which I'm no good at. I always, read, turned over on my side. But with books, you have to, force them open. And of course, you need the light on. And with an e-reader, you don't need the light on. And when you feel that, it's time to go to sleep, you just turn the thing off. And then, you pull the covers up and you go to sleep. So it has those advantages. I don't know. I loved books. Actually, I worked with books for close to 15 years, and I'm worried about books disappearing, physical books disappearing, because we find that the librarians who are supposed to be custodians of this now delight in destroying as many physical books as they can, with the possibility that a great number of how many books is Google digitized? What percentage of the total? 10, 20%? It would seem that a great number of books published are going to actually physically disappear. So those are my thoughts on that. Isn't Shawshank Redemption ranked the #1 movie ever in IMDb? It was for the longest time, may still be. That's a question from Wolf Barney. Yeah, it's a teenage revenge fantasy with a happy ending, which is golly, what can I say? Oh, and boy, that Stephen King sure doesn't like Christians. They're so vicious and hypocritical. All of them. Every single one. An underrated movie from 1994 is The Last Seduction by Picasso 88. There was the woman in that movie. Her name is Linda Fiorentino. And, her star burned brightly. And then, it faded, disappeared, which is a real shame because she's really, really good. And also, golly, she had, just in the space of just a few years. I mean, this movie Vision Quest with Matthew Modine, I like her in that. And of course, she's in one of my very favorite movies, After Hours, playing a sexy nutcase. But of course, After Hours is full of sexy nutcases. Every woman that we meet in this movie is a sexy nutcase. I don't know. Oh, what? Her involvement in an incident came to light relating to her criminal ex-boyfriend and the conviction of her FBI ex-boyfriend. Oh, okay. Anthony Pellicano? Oh, yikes. Okay. Maybe that might have something to do with the eclipse of her career. A shame, though. The Scatman Crothers Morgan Freeman type. Do you have a... Oh, this is a question to Seraphim Goose from Coachulango. Stephen King loves putting the wise black man in his books, says Wolf Barney. Oh, yeah, that's the prisoners, except for, the sodomites. Just a nice bunch of guys. Of course, you see that in Escape from Alcatraz, which is a much better movie, But just these guys who are in Alcatraz, the worst of the worst, just such a nice bunch of guys. Okay. She blew the heat she got from Last Seduction by doing Friedkin's Jade, a massive flop. Also a terrible, terrible movie. Okay, so that's going to be it for today and this week. Thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. What's coming up on the show next week? Let's take a look. I'm going to be talking about Donald Fagen on Music Monday, January 10th. On the book club next week, I'm going to be talking a biography of Billy Wilder by Joseph McBride. And on Theater Thursday, I am going to be talking about Jean Cocteau's 1946 classic La Belle et la Bête, or Beauty and the Beast. So, if you'd like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this benediction. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. A good night.